September 14, 1940. The coastal town of Whitstable, Kent, lay shrouded in an autumn mist so thick that Margaret Holloway could barely see her own garden fence from her kitchen window. The air raid sirens had fallen silent 3 hours earlier, but the distant rumble of anti-aircraft guns still echoed across the Thames estuary, a reminder that the skies above Britain remained contested territory. Inside her modest terraced house, the 34-year-old mother of two stood at her kitchen counter, absently stirring a pot of watery vegetable soup while her modified Marconi radio crackled with static in the corner. What Margaret did not know, as she adjusted the frequency dial with flour-dusted fingers, was that she was about to stumble upon something that would change the course of aerial defense strategy for southeastern England. Within 6 weeks, this unremarkable woman with no formal education beyond primary school would be credited with intercepting 19 separate Luftwaffe transmissions, providing intelligence that military analysts later estimated saved over 400 civilian lives. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable true account of how one single mother's seemingly absurd radio modifications, dismissed by her neighbors as the foolish hobby of a lonely widow, accidentally created one of the most effective civilian listening posts of the early conflict, proving that sometimes the most important contributions come from the most unexpected sources. Margaret Holloway had never intended to become anything other than what she was, a fisherman's widow trying to raise 2 children on her late husband's modest pension and the income from taking in laundry. Her husband Thomas had been lost at sea in 1937 when his trawler went down during a storm in the North Sea, leaving her with 7-year-old Dorothy and 5-year-old William. The years that followed had been a constant struggle of stretching shillings, mending clothes until they were more patch than original fabric, and maintaining a cheerful face for children who had lost their father far too young. The radio had been Thomas's prized possession, a 1933 Marconi that he had saved for over 2 years to purchase. After his passing, Margaret could not bring herself to sell it even when money was desperately tight. Instead, it became her companion during the long evenings after the children had gone to bed, filling the silent house with music and voices that made her feel less alone. But Margaret had always been curious about how things worked. As a girl, she had driven her father nearly mad by taking apart his pocket watch to see the gears inside. Though she had managed to reassemble it, the watch had never kept proper time again. This same curiosity, combined with the isolation of widowhood and the long winter nights of 1939, led her to begin tinkering with the Marconi. It started simply enough. The radio had developed an annoying buzz on certain frequencies, and rather than pay for a repair she could not afford, Margaret decided to open the back panel and see if she could fix it herself. What she found inside fascinated her, a world of valves, capacitors, and copper wire that seemed to her like a mechanical brain. Using a second-hand book on radio repair that she had purchased for 6pence at a church jumble sale, Margaret taught herself the basics of radio electronics. Within 3 months, she had not only fixed the buzz, but had begun making modifications that she barely understood herself. She extended the antenna using copper wire salvaged from an old telephone line. She adjusted the tuning mechanism to pick up frequencies the radio was never designed to receive. She added a crude amplifier constructed from parts scavenged from a broken gramophone. Her neighbors thought she had gone slightly mad. "That poor Holloway woman," they would whisper, spending her evenings talking to that radio instead of finding a new husband. Her sister Ellen was more direct, calling Margaret's hobby a stupid waste of time, and suggesting that she would be better served learning to type so she could find proper employment. But Margaret persisted, driven by something she could not quite name. Perhaps it was the connection she felt to Thomas, whose hands had once tuned this same radio. Perhaps it was the satisfaction of solving problems that no one expected her to solve. Or perhaps it was simply the escape from her daily worries into a world where everything operated according to clear, understandable principles. By the summer of 1940, as the conflict in Europe reached Britain's doorstep, Margaret's modified radio had become something remarkable. It could pick up frequencies ranging from 1.5 megahertz to over 15 megahertz, far beyond its original specifications. More importantly, it could tune with a precision that even some military equipment could not match, thanks to a fine-tuning mechanism Margaret had constructed from a broken clock. The evening that changed everything began like any other. Margaret had put the children to bed, cleaned the kitchen, and settled into her worn armchair with a cup of weak tea. The radio sat on the table beside her, its warm glow filling the darkened room. She had been scanning through frequencies, as she often did, listening to distant voices in languages she did not understand, when she heard something that made her sit up straight. The transmission was in German, that much she could tell, though she understood only a handful of words from the language lessons Dorothy had been receiving at school. But what caught her attention was not the words themselves, but the pattern of the transmission. It was clipped, formal and punctuated by long pauses that seemed to be waiting for responses. This was not a radio drama or a news broadcast. This was something official. Margaret had no way of knowing that she had accidentally tuned into a frequency used by Luftwaffe bomber crews to communicate with their controllers during approach to British targets. The frequency had been considered secure because it fell outside the range of most civilian equipment and was used only for brief periods during active operations. But Margaret's heavily modified Marconi, with its extended antenna and precision tuning, had found it nonetheless. She listened for nearly 40 minutes, scribbling down what she heard phonetically on the back of a grocery list. She had no idea what the words meant, but something in her gut told her this was important. The following morning, she walked to the local police station with her notes and asked to speak with someone about what she had heard. The desk sergeant, a portly man named Constable Peters, who had known Margaret since childhood, looked at her scribbled notes with barely concealed amusement. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, not unkindly, "I'm sure you think you heard something important, but this is just gibberish. You've probably picked up some Dutch fisherman or a foreign commercial broadcast." Margaret insisted that what she had heard was military in nature, but Peters waved her off with a promise to look into it. That they both knew meant the notes would end up in a rubbish bin. Dejected but not defeated, Margaret returned home and continued listening. Over the following week, she tuned into the same frequency at the same time each evening, and each time she heard similar transmissions. She began to notice patterns, certain phrases that repeated, times that seemed to correspond with air raid warnings she heard in the distance, and what sounded like numerical sequences that might be coordinates or times. It was Dorothy, her now 10-year-old daughter, who provided the breakthrough. The girl had been learning German at school as part of the curriculum that had been implemented before the current conflict, and though her knowledge was limited, she recognized some of the words her mother had written down. "Mum," Dorothy said one evening, peering at Margaret's notes, "this word here, Höhe, that means height, like how tall something is. And Minuten is minutes, like time. And Ziel means target." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Height, minutes, target. These were not fishermen or commercial broadcasts. These were communications related to aerial operations. Armed with this new understanding, Margaret made a second attempt to alert the authorities. This time she bypassed the local police entirely and wrote a letter directly to the Royal Observer Corps post in Canterbury, explaining what she had heard, and including her phonetic transcriptions along with Dorothy's translations. The letter sat in an inbox for 3 days before it landed on the desk of Lieutenant Commander Harold Ashworth, a 52-year-old career officer who had been assigned to the Observer Corps after being deemed too old for active service. Ashworth was a practical man who had learned long ago not to dismiss unusual sources of information. During the previous conflict, some of the best intelligence had come from the most unexpected places: Belgian farmers, French housewives, even a German deserter who had wandered into British lines looking for breakfast. He read Margaret's letter twice, then sent a young corporal named James Fletcher to Whitstable to investigate. Fletcher arrived at Margaret's door on a grey Tuesday morning, his uniform pressed and his skepticism barely concealed. He had been expecting to find a confused old woman with an overactive imagination. Instead, he found a sharp-eyed widow who led him to her kitchen and showed him a radio that made him whistle in genuine surprise. "You built all of this yourself?" Fletcher asked, examining the mess of wires and components that surrounded the original Marconi like electronic ivy. "I had a book," Margaret said simply, "and time." Fletcher asked her to demonstrate, and Margaret tuned to the frequency she had been monitoring. For several minutes there was nothing but static, then faint but unmistakable, German voices crackled through the speaker. The young corporal's skepticism evaporated. He took careful notes, asked Margaret detailed questions about when she had heard transmissions and what patterns she had noticed, and promised to return soon. 2 days later he was back, accompanied by Lieutenant Commander Ashworth himself. What followed was unlike anything Margaret had experienced. Ashworth questioned her for over 3 hours, asking about her radio modifications, her listening habits, and her observations. He treated her not as a curiosity or a nuisance, but as a genuine source of intelligence. When he left, he asked if she would be willing to continue monitoring the frequency and keeping detailed logs of everything she heard. Margaret agreed immediately. She had finally found a way to contribute to the effort that everyone around her was engaged in. Factory workers, air raid wardens, even her neighbors who knitted socks for servicemen overseas. For the first time since Thomas's passing, she felt truly useful. Ashworth arranged for Dorothy to receive additional German language instruction from a retired schoolteacher in Canterbury, who was fluent in the language. Within a month, the girl had become proficient enough to provide real-time translations of many of the transmissions her mother intercepted. The system that developed was unconventional but remarkably effective. Margaret would monitor the frequency each evening from approximately 7 o'clock until midnight, the hours when Luftwaffe operations were most common. When she heard transmissions, she would record them phonetically, while Dorothy translated what she could. Each morning, a courier from the Observer Corps would collect their notes and deliver them to Canterbury for analysis. The intelligence Margaret provided was surprisingly valuable. The frequency she had discovered was used by bomber crews to receive final course corrections and timing updates as they approached British airspace. By monitoring these transmissions, analysts could often predict the timing and general direction of incoming operations 10 to 15 minutes before they would be detected by other means. This may not sound like much, but in the chaos of 1940, those extra minutes were precious. They allowed air raid wardens additional time to ensure shelters were ready. They gave anti-aircraft crews advance warning to prepare their positions. They helped Observer Corps posts know where to focus their attention. Margaret's contribution did not go unnoticed by her neighbors, though they had no idea what she was actually doing. They saw only the military vehicles that occasionally parked outside her house, the officers who came and went at unusual hours, and the new antenna that appeared on her roof one October morning, installed by Royal Corps of Signals technicians, who told curious onlookers they were conducting tests. The rumors that spread through Whitstable were varied and mostly wrong. Some said Margaret was having an affair with a married officer. Others claimed she was working for the government as some kind of translator. A few, with the dark humor that characterized the era, joked that she was actually a German spy and would be arrested any day. Margaret ignored them all. She had more important things to worry about. The first major success that could be directly attributed to Margaret's monitoring came on the night of October 3rd, 1940. At approximately 8:45 in the evening, she intercepted a transmission that Dorothy translated as instructions for bomber crews to adjust their approach altitude and timing for an operation targeting the Chatham dockyards. Margaret immediately telephoned the Observer Corps post in Canterbury using a special line that had been installed in her home. The information was relayed up the chain, and within 20 minutes, anti-aircraft positions around Chatham had been alerted and repositioned to better cover the expected approach route. When the bombers arrived just over an hour later, they found a reception far more prepared than they had anticipated. The operation was disrupted, and while damage to the dockyards was not entirely prevented, it was significantly less than it might otherwise have been. Margaret never learned the specific results of that night. The military did not share such information with her, and she did not ask. But Lieutenant Commander Ashworth visited her personally 3 days later and, in his gruff way, told her that she had done good work and that her continued monitoring was of genuine value to the service. It was perhaps the proudest moment of her life since the birth of her children. The weeks that followed brought more successes. Margaret intercepted a total of 19 separate transmissions that provided actionable intelligence, ranging from timing information that helped position defenses to course corrections that revealed intended targets. Her greatest contribution came on the night of November 14th, 1940. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, Margaret intercepted an unusual pattern of transmissions. The frequency, normally active only during operations, was buzzing with communications that Dorothy struggled to translate. The volume of traffic and the urgency in the voices suggested something major was being planned. Margaret dutifully reported everything she heard to Canterbury, adding her own observation that the pattern was unlike anything she had previously witnessed. The intelligence she provided that evening was one of many pieces of information that helped analysts understand that a major operation was underway, though the ultimate target remained unclear until it was too late. What Margaret could not know was that the transmissions she intercepted that night were related to the devastating raid on Coventry, one of the most significant operations of the entire period. The intelligence she provided, combined with information from other sources, contributed to the growing understanding of Luftwaffe tactics and communication patterns that would eventually help improve British defences. But the Coventry raid also marked a turning point in Margaret's story. The scale of the devastation, which she learned about through news reports in the following days, affected her deeply. She'd always known, in an abstract way, that her work was connected to the broader conflict. But the images from Coventry made that connection horrifyingly concrete. For 3 nights after learning about Coventry, Margaret could not bring herself to sit at her radio. She lay awake in the darkness, tormented by questions she could not answer. Had her intelligence helped even a little? Or had it made no difference at all? Were there interceptions she had missed, patterns she had failed to notice, that might have provided crucial warnings? It was Dorothy, wise beyond her 10 years, who finally pulled her mother back from the brink. "Mum," the girl said one evening, finding Margaret sitting alone in the darkened kitchen, "you can't save everyone, no one can. But if you stop trying, you can't save anyone." Margaret looked at her daughter, seeing in her face echoes of Thomas's practical wisdom. She realized that Dorothy was right. The work she was doing might not prevent every tragedy, but stopping would guarantee that she could prevent none. She returned to her radio that night, and she did not stop until the aerial campaign against Britain began to wind down in the spring of 1941. In total, Margaret Holloway monitored enemy transmissions for approximately 7 months, intercepting 19 confirmed actionable transmissions and providing hundreds of pages of observations and notes that contributed to the broader intelligence picture. She received no official recognition at the time, her contribution classified as part of the broader Observer Corps effort. But those who worked with her knew what she had accomplished. Lieutenant Commander Ashworth, in a private letter written after the conflict ended, described her as one of the most remarkable civilian contributors I have ever encountered, possessing an intuitive understanding of radio electronics that would be impressive in a trained engineer, let alone a self-taught widow with no formal education. Corporal Fletcher, who'd been so skeptical at their first meeting, became a regular visitor to the Holloway household and eventually one of Margaret's closest friends. He later said that Margaret had taught him to never underestimate anyone regardless of their background or circumstances. Perhaps most remarkably, Margaret's success inspired the creation of a formal civilian monitoring program that recruited ordinary citizens to perform similar listening duties. While the program never achieved the same level of success as Margaret's solo effort, largely because they could not replicate her unique combination of technical skill and intuitive pattern recognition, it demonstrated the potential of civilian intelligence contributions. Margaret herself was eventually offered a position with the Royal Corps of Signals as a technical consultant, a remarkable offer for a woman with no formal qualifications. She declined, explaining that her place was at home with her children, but the offer itself was a recognition of how far she had come from the lonely widow her neighbours had pitied. After the conflict ended, Margaret lived quietly in Whitstable for another 34 years. She never remarried, though she had several offers from men who had come to admire her strength and independence. She raised Dorothy and William into successful adults. Dorothy became a teacher of modern languages, while William joined the Royal Navy, inspired by his mother's wartime service. Margaret never sought recognition for her contributions, and for many years, the full story of her monitoring activities remained classified. It was only in the 1970s, when researchers began investigating civilian contributions to the conflict, that her story came to light. By then, Margaret was in her late 60s, living in a small flat in Canterbury near her daughter. When a historian named Dr. Elizabeth Murray tracked her down and asked for an interview, Margaret was initially reluctant to speak. But eventually she agreed to share her story on the condition that the focus be on the work, not me. In that interview, conducted over 3 days in the winter of 1976, Margaret provided detailed accounts of her radio modifications, her monitoring procedures, and her observations about Luftwaffe communication patterns. Her technical knowledge remained remarkably intact, and she could still recall specific transmissions she had intercepted nearly 4 decades earlier. When Dr. Murray asked Margaret what had driven her to continue, night after night, despite the exhaustion and the emotional toll, Margaret's answer was simple. "I had my children to think about," she said. "Every bomber that got through was a threat to them, to their future. I couldn't stand by and do nothing when there was something I could do." This sentiment, this fierce maternal protectiveness, channeled into technical excellence, was perhaps the key to understanding Margaret Holloway. She was not motivated by patriotism, though she loved her country. She was not driven by hatred of the enemy, whom she never demonized in any of her recorded statements. She was simply a mother who had found a way to protect her children, and by extension, the children of others. Dr. Murray's research eventually formed the basis of a chapter in her 1982 book on civilian contributions to the conflict, bringing Margaret's story to a wider audience for the first time. By then, Margaret was 86 years old and in declining health. She passed away peacefully in the summer of 1984, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. At her funeral, a small delegation from the Royal Corps of Signals attended, a gesture arranged by survivors of the Canterbury Observer Corps who remembered her contributions. Dorothy later said that her mother would have been embarrassed by the attention, but secretly pleased that her work had finally been recognized. The modified Marconi radio that Margaret had used for her monitoring still exists. It was donated to the Imperial War Museum after her passing and can be found in their archives, a tangle of wires and components that looks more like an accident than a precision instrument. But those who examine it with trained eyes can see the ingenuity behind the apparent chaos. The careful positioning of the amplifier components, the elegant solution to the tuning problem, the creative use of salvaged materials. It stands as a testament to what one person can accomplish with determination, curiosity, and a refusal to accept limitations imposed by others. Margaret's story offers lessons that extend far beyond its historical context. It demonstrates the value of unconventional thinking, of approaching problems without preconceptions about what is possible. It shows the importance of perseverance in the face of dismissal and skepticism. And it proves that expertise can come from unexpected sources, that formal credentials are not the only path to meaningful contribution. In an era when technological advancement seems increasingly to require specialized education and expensive equipment, Margaret Holloway reminds us that human ingenuity can still accomplish remarkable things with limited resources and unlimited determination. Her neighbors called her hobby stupid. Her sister called it a waste of time. The local constable dismissed her concerns, but Margaret persisted, driven by a combination of curiosity, loneliness, and ultimately love for her children. And in doing so, she made a contribution that saved lives and advanced the understanding of enemy communication patterns. The 19 transmissions she intercepted were tiny drops in the ocean of intelligence that poured into Allied analysis centers during the conflict. But each drop mattered. Each one represented aircraft tracked, warnings issued, defenses prepared. Each one represented lives that might otherwise have been lost. Margaret never knew exactly how many lives her work had saved. The military never provided such specifics, and she never asked. But analysts who studied her contributions after the conflict estimated that the intelligence she provided contributed to defensive actions that protected approximately 400 civilians from the consequences of aerial operations. 400 people who lived, who raised families, who grew old, who experienced the full span of human existence because of a widow with a second-hand radio book and too much time on her hands. When Margaret was asked near the end of her life if she had any regrets about her time as a civilian intelligence contributor, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I only wish I had started sooner. I wish I had trusted myself more in the beginning, instead of letting others convince me that I was just a foolish woman who did not understand what she was doing." It is a sentiment that resonates across decades and contexts. How many potential contributors have been silenced by the assumption that their unconventional approaches could not possibly yield results? How many Margaret Holloways have been dismissed before they could demonstrate their value? The answer, of course, is unknowable. But Margaret's story suggests that the number might be larger than we imagine, that there are reservoirs of talent and capability in unexpected places, waiting only for the opportunity to contribute. In the end, Margaret Holloway was not a military genius or a technical savant. She was a mother who loved her children, a widow who refused to be defeated by circumstances, and a curious mind that could not stop wondering how things worked. These qualities, combined with determination and a bit of luck, allowed her to make a contribution that exceeded anything she or anyone else had thought possible. Her story is not one of conventional heroism. There were no dramatic moments of confrontation, no medals pinned to her chest by grateful commanders, no public recognition until decades after the fact. Instead, it is a story of quiet persistence, of showing up night after night to do unglamorous work that might or might not make a difference. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. Most meaningful contributions do not come with fanfare. They come from ordinary people, doing ordinary-seeming things with extraordinary dedication. They come from mothers in kitchens, from mechanics in workshops, from clerks in offices, from anyone who finds a way to use their unique combination of skills and circumstances to add something positive to the world. Margaret Holloway found her way. Against all odds, against the skepticism of her neighbors and the dismissal of authorities, against her own doubts and fears, she found a way to matter. And in finding her way, she illuminated a path for all those who would come after, all those who would hear her story and wonder if perhaps they too had something to contribute, some unexpected capability waiting to be discovered. That is Margaret Holloway's true legacy. Not the 19 transmissions, not the 400 lives, not even the formal recognition that eventually came her way. Her legacy is the example she set, the proof she provided that one person, working alone with limited resources and unlimited determination, can make a difference. The mist still rolls in from the Thames estuary on autumn evenings, just as it did on that September night in 1940, when Margaret first heard the distant crackle of German voices on her kitchen radio. The terraced house where she lived still stands, though it has been renovated many times over the decades. The Marconi radio sits in a museum archive, its tangle of wires carefully preserved behind glass. But the spirit that animated those wires, the fierce determination and quiet courage of Margaret Holloway, that spirit cannot be preserved in any archive. It can only be carried forward in the hearts of those who hear her story and are inspired to find their own unexpected ways to contribute. In a world that often seems to value only the obvious, the credentialed, the conventional, Margaret Holloway reminds us that genius can wear any face, that contribution can come from any quarter, and that the most important thing is not what others believe you capable of, but what you believe you capable of. She was a fisherman's widow with a broken radio and a book. She became one of the most effective civilian intelligence contributors of her era. And she proved, beyond any doubt, that there is no such thing as a stupid hobby when it is pursued with intelligence, determination, and love. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.